Behind the sandstone walls of Walla Walla, Washington's most feared prison, lies a history written in blood, riots, corruption, and impossible survival. This is not just a penitentiary, it is a fortress built from violence, rebellion, and secrets the state never wanted exposed. When Washington was still carving itself out of wild frontier land, crime was rising faster than the towns could grow. Bandits, drifters, murderers, and outlaws moved freely across the Northwest. The territory needed a place strong enough to hold men who refused to obey the new laws of the young state. And so in 1886, on a flat field in Walla Walla, construction began on what would become the most feared institution in Washington history, Washington State Penitentiary. The prison wasn't designed like a normal jail. It was built like a fortress. Massive stone walls more than 20 feet high. Guard towers at every corner. Iron gates so heavy it took multiple men to pull them open. From the very beginning, the message was clear: no one leaves this place unless the state decides. Inside, the early prison system was primitive and brutal. Inmates worked long days under the sun, crushing stone. Building new wings and expanding the compound, overcrowding started almost immediately. The prison was built for order, but chaos arrived instead. The cells filled with violent offenders, drifters, and men hardened by the frontier. As Washington grew, Walla Walla grew with it. It soon became the center of the state's entire corrections system, housing execution chambers, solitary blocks, and high-security wings. The penitentiary wasn't just a prison. It was the heart of Washington's punishment machine, a fortress built from fear and hardened by every desperate man who ever tried to survive inside its walls. The foundations of Walla Walla carried more than concrete and steel. They carried the beginning of a legacy of riots, brutality, and violence that would shape Washington's prison history for over 130 years. By the mid-20th century, Washington State Penitentiary wasn't just a prison, it was the centerpiece of the entire correctional system, the place where the worst, the most violent, and the most uncontrollable inmates were sent. Every failure in Washington's justice system, every overcrowded county jail, every high-risk criminal, all roads led to Walla Walla. But the system wasn't prepared for what it was creating. The penitentiary was built for a few hundred men, but the state kept sending more. Soon Walla Walla became severely overcrowded, with inmates packed shoulder to shoulder in aging cell blocks built decades earlier. Tempers rose, gangs formed. The balance of power shifted from the guards to the strongest inmate groups. The state's policies did not help. Instead of rehabilitation, they relied on punishment and containment, filling the prison with long-term inmates with nothing left to lose. Violent offenders, gang leaders, mentally ill prisoners, escape risks, and death. Row inmates lived only steps away from each other. Inside this pressure cooker, one mistake could spark a riot, one rumor could start a gang war. One act of retaliation could ignite a chain reaction. The prison environment became unpredictable, explosive, and increasingly impossible to control. Guards were outnumbered, and many worked double shifts with outdated equipment and minimal training. They tried to use military-style discipline, but the inmates adapted faster. The prison became a battlefield of authority versus survival. By the 1970s, Walla Walla wasn't just overcrowded, it was a time bomb, a system full of fear, a fortress full of pressure. A place where a single spark would soon erupt into the deadliest riots Washington had ever seen. By the late 1970s, Washington State Penitentiary was a powder keg, and in 1979, the explosion finally came. It began with a simple spark, a dispute between inmates and guards over harsh restrictions, overcrowding, and constant lockdowns. But beneath that spark lay years of tension, fear, and anger. Within hours, Walla Walla was no longer a prison. It was a war zone. On a cold February evening, inmates took advantage of gaps in guard coverage and seized control of multiple cell blocks. Guards were dragged inside, beaten, and taken hostage. Inmates smashed windows, broke into supply rooms, and armed themselves with makeshift weapons and stolen tools. For the first time in Washington history, the state lost control of its maximum security prison. Smoke rose from burning buildings. Alarm sirens failed. Even the state police hesitated to enter. The risk was too high. Inside the chaos, inmate factions formed their own governments, controlling movement, food, and negotiations. Some protected the hostages. Others wanted blood. The prison became a city of gangs, each fighting for power in the middle of the destruction. The peace didn't last. 2 years later, another eruption tore through the penitentiary, fueled by gang rivalries, constant brutality, and a system at its breaking point. This time, multiple buildings were set on fire, 2 inmates were killed, several guards were injured trying to retake control. The state nearly activated the National Guard. The message was clear. Walla Walla was not just unsafe, it was uncontrollable. These riots forced Washington to overhaul its entire correctional system. New security units, electronic surveillance, tactical response teams, strict segregation for gang leaders, reinforced housing blocks. The deadliest riots in state history didn't just damage buildings. They reshaped the future of every prison in Washington. Walla Walla became more fortified, more militarized, and more feared than ever. A fortress rebuilt from smoke, fire, and the screams echoing through its halls. Washington State Penitentiary didn't earn its fearsome reputation from its walls alone. It earned it from the monsters, masterminds, and legends who were locked inside them. For over a century, Walla Walla became the final destination for criminals whose stories terrified the entire Northwest. Jake Bird was no ordinary killer. A traveling railroad worker who left a trail of bodies across America. Bird was convicted in 1947. But inside the courtroom, he did something that froze the world. He cursed the judge, jury, and everyone who sent him to Walla Walla. Within months, 6 people connected to his case mysteriously died. Reporters called it the Jake Bird Hex. Inside Walla Walla, Bird was unpredictable, violent, and feared by inmates and guards alike. Before his execution, he confessed to 44 murders, making him one of the most prolific serial killers in U.S. history. His presence alone turned the penitentiary into a place of legends and nightmares. Campbell was sentenced for one of the most brutal triple murders in Washington's history: a mother, her daughter, and a neighbor. Inside Walla Walla, he became a symbol of raw aggression. Defiant, unbreakable, and constantly challenging guards and inmates, he spent years in solitary confinement due to his violent behavior. Campbell's execution in the prison's death chamber marked one of the most controversial moments in Washington's capital punishment history. A former military helicopter pilot with a hidden double life, Yates murdered at least 13 women, though investigators believe the number is far higher. When he arrived at Walla Walla, the media swarmed the gates. His crime shook the entire state, and his presence in WSP cemented the prison as the home of Washington's deadliest criminals. Violent gang leaders responsible for multi-state operations, contract killers tied to organized crime, lifers who became prison shot callers, escape artists whose stories fueled prison folklore. Each one added another layer of darkness to Walla Walla's history. Their reputations turned the penitentiary into a symbol of danger, a place where the worst of humanity was locked away, but never forgotten. Inside Washington State Penitentiary, survival was never guaranteed. For decades, Walla Walla wasn't just a prison, it was a battlefield, a place where the strong ruled, the weak vanished, and every day began with the same question: will I make it to tomorrow? From the 1940s to the 1980s, Walla Walla's daily life was defined by brutality. The overcrowded tiers echoed with fights, threats, and the metallic slam of cell doors. Guards patrolled the corridors like soldiers, but control often slipped into the hands of gangs that operated with ruthless efficiency. Inmates described the atmosphere as constant war. A wrong look could get you stabbed, a wrong word could get you jumped, and the guards rarely arrived in time or chose not to. The big yard became the most dangerous place in the entire prison. Hundreds of inmates released at the same time, all carrying their alliances, rage, and weapons carved from metal scraps. Fights broke out almost daily. Racial tension, gang politics, gambling debts, everything ended in violence. Surviving the yard required one of 3 things: a powerful gang behind you, a reputation for violence, or complete silent invisibility. Those who had none of these lived in fear every second the gates opened. The whole Walla Walla solitary unit became notorious. Inmates were locked inside for weeks or months, in darkness, freezing cells, and complete isolation. Food trays slid through slots. Voices echoed through the concrete. Men lost their minds. Some never came back. Yet even solitary became a test of survival. Broken men were easier to control, easier to punish, easier to erase. In Walla Walla, violence didn't just come from inmates. It came from every direction. Prisoners reported beatings during searches, retaliation from guards after riots, forced compliance, abuse hidden behind paperwork, punishments disguised as discipline. It was a world where the system's power was absolute and mercy was rare. Some men adapted. Some men broke. Others rose to power inside the chaos. To survive Walla Walla during its darkest decades, inmates learned how to walk, who to trust, where to sit, when to speak, when to fight, when to disappear. Every decision mattered. Every mistake could be fatal. This wasn't rehabilitation. This wasn't correction. This was survival in its rawest, most brutal form. Walla Walla didn't just hold men, it reshaped them. For more than a century, Washington State Penitentiary stood like an unbreakable fortress. But inside those walls, men trapped for life were willing to risk everything, even death, for one chance at freedom. Walla Walla's escape history isn't just a list of attempts. It's a collection of daring, desperate, almost unbelievable stories the prison system tried to bury. In the early years, Walla Walla was rough, unfinished, and full of blind spots. Inmates dug tunnels with spoons, hid tools under their mattresses, and used darkness to their advantage. One of the most bizarre escapes came when an inmate stole a prison horse from the work yard and galloped straight through the front fields, disappearing into the rolling hills. For weeks, he became a local legend, the outlaw who rode out of the fortress. But Walla Walla always caught up. He was dragged back in chains, proving the prison's long reach. The most infamous early escape happened in 1955 when 2 inmates overpowered a guard, stole his keys, and slipped out during a shift change. Once outside the walls, they stole a car, triggering a multi-state manhunt. For days, news headlines screamed about dangerous fugitives roaming the Northwest. When they were finally caught, bruised and exhausted, the state responded by tightening security, adding new towers, and reinforcing the walls. But the blueprint for escape was already in the minds of every inmate inside. During the violent decades surrounding the major riots, escape attempts became more sophisticated and more dangerous. Inmates tried everything. Scaling walls using stolen sheets, climbing onto rooftops during yard time, sneaking into delivery trucks, faking injuries to get moved to outside medical units, breaking through ventilation shafts. One group almost made it over the perimeter using construction scaffolding before guards opened fire, forcing them down. Another inmate made it outside the walls but was captured hiding in an irrigation ditch, freezing, starving, and defeated. The truth was brutal Walla Walla's walls were too high, the towers too sharp, and the land around it too open. Even if you got out, you had nowhere to go. For many serving life sentences, escape wasn't a plan, it was an obsession. They studied guard routines, counted patrol steps, memorized blind spots, and waited for the perfect storm. A riot, a power outage, a guard mistake, a distraction, a shift change, even then, success was almost impossible. Because Walla Walla had one final advantage: every inmate who escaped eventually came back or died trying. Over 100 years, Walla Walla became known as a place you can enter, but never leave. The fortress stood undefeated, its escape history filled with broken dreams, broken bones, and broken men. Each attempt only made the walls stronger, the guards stricter, the punishments harsher. Walla Walla wasn't just a prison. It was a trap, airtight, merciless, and designed to crush hope. Inside Washington State Penitentiary, the men with keys didn't always feel like they were in control. Walla Walla was a place where guards walked the tiers with the same fear as the inmates, but with authority that could turn deadly. For decades, the line between order and brutality blurred until no one could tell the difference. New guards entered the prison thinking they were there to enforce rules. By the end of their first week, they realized they were entering a battlefield. The moment they stepped onto the tiers, they felt it. Hundreds of eyes watching dozens of gangs sizing them up. The constant threat of riot or assault. Some guards described the environment as walking into a lion's cage with nothing but a uniform. Fear shaped their actions, and fear turned into aggression. To maintain control inside overcrowded blocks, guards developed a harsh system: quick takedowns, lockdowns, for minor issues, cell tosses. Where everything was destroyed night, time raids, brutal responses to disrespect. To inmates, it looked like abuse. To guards, it felt like survival. But over time, discipline became domination, control became intimidation, and punishment became routine. Guards and inmates lived by codes that didn't exist on paper. For guards, the unwritten laws were clear. Never show weakness, never turn your back, never lose control, protect each other, no matter what. This led to a culture where mistakes were hidden incidents were covered up, and retaliation became a quiet tradition. If an inmate assaulted a guard, the next week the prison found a way to make that inmate disappear into solitary, or worse. Every day inside Walla Walla was a test of nerve. Guards had to walk straight, speak firmly, and never flinch. Because once an inmate sensed fear, the entire tier smelled blood. Many guards carried a constant feeling of paranoia, sleeplessness, hypervigilance, stress that followed them home. Some turned cold and aggressive. Others cracked under the pressure. A few crossed the line and joined the very corruption they were supposed to stop. The deadly riots of 1979 and 1981 changed everything. The old style of control through force was no longer enough. The state responded by creating tactical response units, Riot control training, military, style formations, psychological screening, new discipline protocols. The guards became more organized, more assertive, and more heavily armed. But the legacy of fear never vanished. It just evolved. Respect, the currency of the prison in Walla Walla, respect was the only thing holding the system together. If inmates respected a guard, violence dropped. If a guard disrespected an inmate, war could break out. Every interaction was a negotiation. Every word mattered. Every decision could light a fuse. A world with no heroes. In the end, Walla Walla turned both sides into survivors. Guards who became soldiers, inmates who became strategists. A prison where humanity was often lost. The behavior of the guards wasn't just about authority. It was about living in a place where power was the only shield against chaos. Behind the towering walls of Washington State Penitentiary, there were two prisons, the one the public saw and the one that truly existed. The real Walla Walla wasn't controlled by the state or the wardens or even the guards. It was controlled by a secret ecosystem of corruption, built quietly over decades, a system where money, fear, power, and silence kept everything running, a black market behind bars inside Walla Walla. Everything had a price. Cigarettes, weapons, narcotics, extra food, favors, protection, information. But these things didn't come from nowhere. They came through the cracks in the system, cracks that guards, staff, and even administrators learned to exploit. Contraband flowed like a river. Some guards were paid thousands to smuggle in drugs. Others carried notes, tools, or even weapons. A few looked the other way during gang-run operations. It wasn't just corruption, it was currency. The hidden alliances, guards, and inmates in a place as violent as Walla Walla, survival didn't depend on rules. It depended on alliances. Certain guards quietly partnered with the most powerful inmates. Trading access for safety, trading favors, for loyalty, trading silence for control, these alliances created shadow governments inside the prison, where inmate leaders controlled entire tiers and guards maintained order by working with them instead of against them. It wasn't official, it wasn't legal, but it kept the violence manageable, at least on the surface. Gangs running the prison from inside, multiple investigations in the 70s, 80s, and 90s uncovered operations run directly from inside Walla Walla. Drug distribution networks, illegal gambling rings, extortion systems, smuggling pipelines, hit orders coordinated through pay phones and staff connections. Some gang leaders had more power inside the prison than they ever had outside. Walla Walla became a headquarters, a command center for criminal empires that operated in the streets while protected behind concrete walls. Hostage negotiations exposed the truth during the major riots. The darkest secret came out. Prison administrators negotiated with gang leaders, not with guards, not with state officials, but with the inmates who controlled the chaos. Behind closed doors, deals were made, transfers, reduced restrictions, special privileges, and in some cases silence. The public never heard the full truth. But those who were inside knew that the riots didn't just show violence. They exposed who really held the power. The code of silence corruption survived because of one rule: nobody talked. Guards protected guards. Inmates protected inmates. Administrators protected the institution. Everyone needed the system to keep running, even if it was built on secrets. Breaking the silence meant losing your job, losing your allies, or losing your life. So the truth stayed buried. A prison built on secrets. By the time investigators finally dug into the corruption, it was too late. The secret system was already part of the prison's DNA. Walla Walla wasn't just a penitentiary. It was a closed world, a dark network of deals, money, and fear that kept the fortress functioning long after the official rules stopped working. Inside those walls, corruption wasn't an accident. It was the structure holding everything together.